Hi, welcome. I am Jim Pfeiffer. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Water Authority. So I want to welcome you all again. And today we have over 100 guests registered. Actually, the last count was 163 to attend today, many from beyond the Sacramento region. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Regional Water Authority, we represent 20 water providers serving 2 million people in the Sacramento region. The RWA is a regional convener focused on coordinating efforts of regional water providers to create a resilient water system that not only benefits the Sacramento region, but the statewide water system. RWA's Cofee and Conversation series is a part of our outreach and advocacy program. If you'd like to learn more, I invite you to review our 2021 Advocacy Program Report, which you can find on the RWA website at rwah2o.org. Now, real quick, a few housekeeping announcements. This webinar is being recorded. Feel free to submit questions as long as we are using the Q&A button on your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible today. Live transcript is available by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, and let's get going. Okay, I see Director Nemeth on. Thank you for joining us, Director Nemeth. And I invite to introduce you real quick. Karla Nemeth was appointed Director of the California Department of Water Resources by Governor Brown in 2018 and reappointed by Governor Newsom in 2019. DWR operates and maintains the California State Water Project, manages floodwaters, monitors dam safety, conducts habitat restoration, and provides technical assistance and funding for projects for local water needs. Karla oversees the department and its mission to manage and protect California's water resources, working with other agencies in order to benefit the state's people and to protect, restore, and enhance the natural and human environments. Karla has worked for the California Natural Resources Agency as Governor Brown's Deputy Secretary and Senior Advisor for Water Policy since 2014. She was the Bay Delta Conservation Plan Project Manager from 2009 to 2014. Prior to that, Karla was an Environmental and Public Affairs Director for the Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation District and Community Affairs Manager at Jones & Stokes. She has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Washington. Welcome, Director Nemeth, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on our statewide water supplies and challenges and opportunities ahead. So, Director Nemeth, I don't know if you want to make some initial remarks before we get into the Q&A.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here today, and I want to thank the Regional Water Authority for doing such a great job, particularly in this difficult year, setting up opportunities for us to communicate better about what's happening around us with our water system. We are in a period of, people can call it all kinds of things. Some people call it the new normal, but it's really clear that our hydrology in California is changing at an accelerated pace relative to how we experience extremes. So we've always had an extreme hydrology in California. I think one of the things that we're really starting to understand is that these events that used to come along, once every couple decades, then started showing up once a decade. And now we've really moved from the episodic deep drought and or intense rain events to something that's really occurring almost every year, every other year. And that is what we mean by the new normal here in California. And to me, one of the most interesting and challenging things about this time is we all anticipate our precipitation, especially here in Northern California, to stay generally about the same overall when you look at kind of these gross averages of precipitation in Northern California. But what's really changing is ambient temperatures. Those are really headed just in one direction. They've been heading in one direction for quite a while, relative to averages and relative to the hots and just a warming low conditions in California. And I want to raise that because it really is that new information and how it influences our hydrology or affects our hydrology, and then how that new hydrology really affects the decisions that we all need to make as water managers. So this year is a perfect example. We had that crazy, very intense dry spell. I think we broke a record for consecutive rainless days at 240 something last October. And then a few days later here in Sacramento, we had our largest single day rainfall total. Then we moved into a November that was below average for precipitation. Then we moved into a December that broke a set of records for precipitation and snowpack. And we were at at least 150% of average across the Sierra by January 1st. We're now down to about 63% of average in the driest January-February period on record. So here we all sit, working hard to respond to, folks call it weather whiplash, but as water managers, I think we're all starting to take stock collectively about what this means for how we operate the system. In a note of optimism, I think we're absolutely up for this challenge as water managers in California. And I think we've all have been watching and studying the climate science as it's been developed over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think we're at a moment where we can push and make really important decisions for Californians, because we're now starting to really feel in a very tangible way the effects of climate. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for water users across the state and water managers across the state to do some really important things that we've always known were important for our resilience over time, but that time is now. So that's a good place to be, because we do have a lot of information. We do have strong working relationships throughout the state, across regions in California, and right here along the American River, really strong relationships with environmental organizations who really want us to do more and do better by the environment as we're making these investments for the future. So that is a good place to be. And so I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to discuss this in more detail with you all today, because I'm certain that I will learn a few things, and I'm eager to learn about some of the ideas in the American River watershed. So thank you again. And Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Director Nemeth. I really appreciate it. You talked a little bit about the drought and what's in store. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you were hopeful for in 2022.
Sure. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful for rain in 2022. We've not yet given up, but it is a serious situation. The past 60 days have been bone dry. They've been running warm. But I would say this: I think we are in a better position last year in a certain respect. Despite coming in with low reservoir storage this year, we're in a better position because we are, frankly, more nimble at responding to the deepening challenge that we now have. And by that, I mean, I think collectively we've made some improvements to forecasting, which was a big challenge last year. If you'll recall, I don't think as water managers, we understood quickly enough what was happening around us in that March timeframe last year. And that landed us at an April 1st, a period between April 1st and May 31st, where we saw an enormous drop off from anticipated runoff into reservoirs, rivers, and streams to what was actually happening on the ground. So last year we had about 22% runoff efficiency on average across the Sierra watershed. We're usually in the 60%. So that's a big flag and a big problem right there. But we're looking at all of that information sooner this year, which means there will be less surprises down the road. And the earlier we can make decisions about preparing for a conservative sense of available water supplies, I think the better off we'll be for our communities, our economy, and the environment in California. So that is my hope for this year, that we make some improvements in the way that we plan for and communicate what's happening with our hydrology and therefore our water supplies.
Thank you. Director Nemeth, it sounds like DWR is doing quite a bit to make sure we don't have that same surprise that I think surprised all of us last year. But let's talk a little bit about local agencies and what can local agencies do or help out in these drought times. What more can local agencies do?
Well, I think we all need to do more in the water conservation space, and it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge given the context of COVID-19 and sort of a general public that has maybe emergency fatigue, if you will. And I think we can all see that, collectively when we look at, where we are with water conservation in California. Typically, when it gets warmer, and we have, especially over the course of the last 2 months, I think we've seen water use bump up a little bit, which is not a surprise. We know that typically when it gets warm, people, water their lawns, or we see that elevation in outdoor use, which is the lion's share of urban water use. So we do need to do more, get connected with our messaging and the tools that people can avail themselves of to lower their water use in the event, not just as this year plays out as dry, but certainly in the event that we experience a dry 2023 as well. So we've got more work to do there. I also think that we have more work to do on what does it mean to be resilient? So we all, I think myself included, took comfort over the last many years and this all of the above strategy. So meaning we have to take care of our surface water supplies, certainly, but we have to connect our surface water supplies with how we manage our groundwater. So real importance of conjunctive use programs. And certainly efforts to recycle water supplies, efforts to conserve water supplies, all of those things going into an all of the above diverse water supply portfolio that we know is going to make our communities resilient. But I do think we need to start getting more specific about what that means and how those projects work together, and get a little bit more ambitious with our ability to identify projects and really schedule them for completion. So the state obviously plays a really important role, be it funding to support groundwater management or regulatory processes to support expanded use of recycled water. But we do want to be making those connections with our local water districts and understand what that portfolio is and how we can work to implement it hand in hand. I also think as water managers, we have a significant challenge with the cost of all these kinds of programs and projects that make our supplies more resilient. And we know we have, deepening economic challenges around us in terms of just a deepening income inequality that does make it difficult for water districts with our traditional approaches to managing for low water rates to ensure that water is affordable, especially when we're serving parts of our community that really do have limited income. So all of those things, I think, need to be working together. This is an opportunity for, frankly, an enormous opportunity for state, federal, and local water district partnership to intentionally enable us to maintain the affordability of water supplies, which again is really important as we look to meet the needs of our communities regardless of income level.
Thank you, Director Nemeth. We were looking at the numbers this morning within the American River, and in the last 20 years, local agencies have spent $200 million in developing conjunctive use facilities, but the state of California has contributed $80 million to that effort. So we're really glad to hear that. That has allowed us to increase our conjunctive use capacity annually by 30,000 acre feet, and the state has, can take credit for a good share of that. I'm going to move on to climate change. Before I get to the question, though, I want to acknowledge that we have a few questions coming up in the queue and some really good ones. What I want to ask you, though, is what is DWR's long-term strategy for adapting to climate change, and where do you see the big challenges?
Well, we touched on one already, which is really the quality of our forecasting. This year, we've implemented some kind of immediate improvements, but we are also investing in a broader understanding together with our partners, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, particularly out of their Denver office, does very sophisticated kinds of forecasting, but also partners with the U.S. Geological Survey, with NASA and others, really to develop the next generation of hydrologic modeling that can take into account, real world conditions, things like soil moisture and increases in evaporation that come with the increase in ambient temperatures. So that's going to be a big challenge for us over the course of the next many years, is to make that shift. And some of that is, human institutional challenge. We're all very comfortable with our probabilistic approaches to, observed history, which is obviously extremely important to sound science, how we look at the data that we've been relying on over time. But we also have to make space for the fact that that data is changing, and that we have had multiple years recently where our real world conditions are outside of historical observation. And then we need to decide what we do about that, and how we adjust our forecasting and expectations for water supplies that are going to materialize as a result of precipitation, as a result of snowpack, and how that's changing by the seasons. So one of the things the department is working on over the course of the next several years is with our federal partners that I mentioned, and I think with good communication with local water districts, is how do we adjust those? It's going to require a significant amount of peer review, because everyone's going to need to know and want to know how conditions around us are changing in ways that manifest water availability. So I think that's an enormous challenge for the department. I think another challenge for the department is certainly how we approach groundwater management, and how we approach recharge that can support depleted aquifers. Typically, California has, as you all may be aware, there is an approach, especially when we look at acquiring water rights to take floodwaters and recharge groundwater basin. A lot of local water districts are looking at, the same surface water. And so what we need to do, and I think is a big challenge going forward, that will in all likelihood occur in the context of implementing sustainable groundwater management, is how we, in an organized way, really take to scale the identification of floodwaters available for recharge and secure the water rights to do so. So obviously that is something that requires significant partnership between the department and my colleagues at the Water Resources Control Board. But I view that as a real big challenge for state agencies working with local agencies moving forward. I would also say one of the things that I find fascinating is the way in which we think about and talk about the integration of flood and water supply. Some of our water districts in California are a water supply agency and a flood agency, but some water districts are not. And so how we put those two things together and how we put the technical information together that enables us to do what we all know we need to do, which is capture water when we have very wet periods so that we can be more drought resilient when the inevitable longer kind of drought frame comes to mind. And I'm going to make a comment that might seem somewhat obvious to many folks on this call, but it's certainly a light bulb really went on for me when I delved a little bit more deeply into the work we're doing on that front at the department. And that is, we do have very different mindsets when it comes to flood management and water supply for hopefully obvious reasons. Flood, top priority is public safety, protecting lives and property. But what that means is we really look at instantaneous flows, and all of our flood modeling and support tools are focused on that very important goal. Over in our water supply world, really what we do are we average over time, and it's the average over time that helps us understand what investments we want to make to ensure that we have reliable water supplies. Well, when we put those things together and we need those things to be talking to each other, we are going to need to really confront and establish new ways of talking about and providing the technical information that can support what it really means to integrate a flood protection approach with a water supply reliability approach. Again, and this watershed, the American River watershed, is kind of in many ways, kind of a hot spot for that, if you will. Lots of opportunity given the flashiness and the expansiveness of the American River watershed as compared to the Folsom Reservoir and how we manage water in this system. So really important partnerships that the department establishes, not just with water supply providers, but also our big flood control agencies. All these folks need to be talking with each other. And that has really given rise to a lot of the state's thinking around how do we think through state funding that supports this kind of multi-benefit approach, flood, water supply, and the environment.
Thank you, Director Nemeth. Before we leave the climate change topic, we had a question from our audience. The question is, in the Delta Adapts report, the Delta Stewardship Council estimated that sea level rise by mid-century would require an additional 1 million acre-feet of freshwater delta outflow to meet current delta water quality standards. How large increase in outflows? So 1 million acre-feet of additional storage from upstream needing to go out to the delta to just maintain the standards that are on the books today. And I think that's a shared problem, not just with DWR and with the Bureau of Reclamation and local water agencies. But I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so pretty thorny issue to be sure. But I think it does speak to more broadly some work that we need to do moving forward to understand the available water based on not just hydrology, but based on rights to use that water. There is some conversation in the public sphere about modernizing our water rights system. I think as a general matter, we don't have a system for administering water rights that really adequately understands what's happening in our system. And I'll give you an example. Last year, both Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources, of course, we are, as junior water rights holders in the system, we are required to meet downstream water quality needs. When things get very, very dry, that becomes not possible given a need to protect upstream storage, both for environmental purposes, but also for longer term drought planning in the event of a follow-on year that's dry. And one of our challenges last year was the departments pursued regulatory relief for certain parts of water quality requirements down in the Delta. And we also installed an emergency drought barrier, which is something we did in the previous drought. And before the previous drought, the last time we had done that was the 1970s. So I think it is indicative that these conditions are upon us. The fact that, 7 years later or 6 years later, we needed to do the same thing versus, decades later. But nevertheless, in working to meet those already revised water requirements, water quality requirements, the releases from the reservoirs were not making it down to the Delta. And typically the Reclamation and the department, we know that we have losses in the system when we move water out of the reservoirs and down to the pumps for transfer purposes, for example. So we already account for that. But what we saw last year was depletion of water released from the reservoirs between right below the dam and down to the Delta at a rate that we had not seen before. And some of that can be water sinking into the ground. Some of that is water that's diverted under multiple overlapping water rights. Some of it is probably diversions that are not legal. So I think one of the things we need to do to deal with this understanding that the Stewardship Council has laid out is we need to start doing work right now to make sure that we understand the water that's extracted from the system, because one, it'll make our water rights system, I think, work better. The existing system needs to work better, given that the challenges we have coming at us. And then I think our ability to do that is also going to inform kind of our next generation of discussion about how do we address the challenges that we have, that the challenges that will be upon us by mid-century around, water quality in the Delta, and what is the best way to balance out needs that we have upstream, downstream, and also the needs that we have for the environment. That's why, in my mind, everything we can be doing to recycle the surface water that's delivered to our communities and put it to use is going to be critical. I also think lowering water use in our urban areas in particular is going to be critical. A lot of folks point to the fact that agriculture uses significantly more water than our cities do, and that is accurate. Agriculture also has significant pressures on it, particularly in managing groundwater basins. And I think over time, we are going to see, multiple things happening in the agricultural sector. It's not just going to be about groundwater recharge and improved efficiency, but I do think ultimately we're going to see in the agricultural sector probably sorry, I can't, the word is not coming to me, but we are going to see contraction of agricultural acreages planted in California. The state administration is focused on doing that in a way that can help preserve and sustain agriculture on our best agricultural lands, but also doing it in a way that really works for communities and those local economies. But I think all of those things are going to need to happen to deal with the challenge that you just raised.
Thank you, Director Nemeth. We're gonna change gears, and we're gonna talk about some remarks that were made last week at a budget hearing. At last week's budget hearing, you had mentioned that the work DWR is doing to look at entire watersheds in the Merced and Tuolumne, analyzing the impacts of climate change. You mentioned the work that they're doing on having a change on the watershed scale. Mm-hmm. We've been coordinating with DWR on similar work in the American River watershed. We believe that we have to take a whole watershed approach in addressing the threats of not just drought, but wildfire, flood, and ecosystem degradation. We call that our supershed approach. My question for you is, how can we jointly advance this holistic approach?
Great question. And you guys are doing incredible work. Deeper in your watershed, I think you're really ahead of the curve from a lot of places on this. So really hats off to you. I think you all are going to see an update of the California Water Plan that goes to this approach. I like the idea of a supershed. And so I think, Jim, that's going to be a very natural place for the department to work together with you all to get some advice and recommendations from you all about what needs to be in the water plan that can help you all do the things that you want to do, but also incentivize other parts of the state to think the way folks are in the American River watershed, which is that, really starting to understand wildfire impacts and the role of mountain meadow restoration, for example, and water supply and quality. So I would say that's probably the biggest opportunity that we have coming up. And the department is really starting right now to get some of that preliminary work done and reaching out to our various stakeholders to seek input on the water plan. And I believe it's next year when we come out with an actual public draft, but there's going to be a lot of opportunity, I think, for interaction before that time.
Thank you. Let's switch gears and let's talk about voluntary agreements and biological opinions and the like. So we had one question that came in this morning. Water suppliers throughout the Sacramento River Basin have stepped forward with reading here, an excellent and unprecedented package of flows and projects for the next 15 years as part of the Voluntary Agreements program. As you know, there is great frustration right now over that. And we were wondering if you had any advice on how to move the voluntary agreements forward and to get to work on the Bay Delta water quality control plan.
You bet. So having been engaged in the voluntary agreement process since I think 2016, I share that sense of frustration. And I would just observe that one of the big challenges with the voluntary agreements that I think have made it difficult to come to completion is the state's goal to do something that is comprehensive, and that is both the Sacramento, watershed, including the American River, of course, but also along the San Joaquin watershed. And I would just observe, not only do we have great diversity in our population in California, we have great diversity of personalities of water districts in California, and people coming at the challenge with different approaches. So I agree that we've done some amazing things in the water user community in terms of a voluntary agreement that where water users are funding the acquisition of water for the environment, and a governance structure that enables everyone to learn as they go about how best to deploy that water to help support the environment. And that, coupled with significant and ambitious restoration programs, I think is going to be important. It really, at the end of the day, I think, well, two things. One, we have significant investment from the state in habitat restoration, landscape scale habitat restoration, and as appropriate, a CEQA exemption for that restoration. We need to do it well and do it right, but I think that was a really important indicator that the state is serious in coming to closure on the voluntary agreements, which is the place, in which, the state, together with water users and environmental groups, are kind of most organized around the need for landscape scale restoration in all of these watersheds. But often it does come down to water, and enough water to test hypotheses to help us really understand what can be accomplished. And so the state is still very focused on bringing these agreements to completion. I would say even more so, given that we have the drought. I think we would like to be in a situation where we can start supporting the species voluntarily as early as next year. And all those conversations are ongoing. I am optimistic that we will come to closure on that, so that we can just get going and start implementing. So while it's taken a while, while it's taken a long time, I also think that the challenges across so many multiple watersheds, it's not surprising that it would take a while to get us to some closure on that kind of term sheet. What needs to happen, though, is when we do that. So I am banking on success here. When we do that, the voluntary agreement does go to the water board itself, and it will incorporate it as an alternative in its water quality control plan process. And so we will have, a 2-year period where we are working to implement in advance of the water board coming to closure. But again, I think that's worthwhile. And I think there's going to be quite a bit of work that we can get done, particularly with available state funding, available federal funding, hopefully, and then certainly financial contributions from the water agencies. So I hear you loud and clear on that. I hope for closure on that too, so we can just really get to implementing.
Thank you, Director Nemeth. I think what we'd like to do is shift gears and talk a little bit about water use efficiency.
Sure.
I'd like to save a little bit of time for some groundwater related questions that are coming up. We might come back to the regulatory environment for surface water if we have a little bit of time left. So here's a question that came in. We share DWR's desire to increase water use efficiency, and we want to make sure the path to getting there doesn't have unintended consequences on affordability and overarching urban climate adaptation. The question is what are the next steps for DWR in urban water use efficiency? Has the department looked at ways in which the cost of implementation and impacts, in particular to urban tree canopies, can be mitigated? And you talked a little bit about this at the beginning of our session, but I was just wondering if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, you bet. And I'm grateful for this question, because one of the things that I've learned over the past year and a half is California passed a really complicated set of legislation under the banner of conservation as a way of life. And so it had 3 components. One was water loss work that's happening at the water board. One was an indoor efficiency standard, which was a joint recommendation from DWR and the Water Board to the legislature, for then the legislature to determine what next to do with that. And then the third piece is outdoor efficiency standards. And that is something that the department would transmit its recommendations for proposed regulation to the Water Board, and then the Water Board itself deliberates on that regulation. And I think one of the things that has been kind of unsatisfying to water users is the fact that those regulations go over to the Water Board, and then the Water Board, through the course of its setting, does the more traditional CEQA analysis that maybe captures some of the broader impacts of implementation. What I will say is the department, so one on the indoor water use efficiency standard, you all are probably aware that it's a two-step phase process. We have a 47 gallons per capita per day sort of recommendation to the legislature for 2025. And then by 2030, that efficiency standard would be lowered to 42 gallons per capita per day to give water agencies an opportunity to kind of get on that glide path. I do believe that most water agencies in California are at about 48. There is some, pretty big variability there. And I think that's the big challenge of implementing this legislation in kind of components is there is pretty big variability across the state in terms of both, frankly, indoor use and outdoor use efficiency. But the legislation was designed to enable water districts to pursue, one, to kind of mix and match, if you will. So these components generate an overall water budget. But the other piece of it is if in putting these pieces together, agencies are not able to get to that water budget, there are ways in which water districts can apply for a variance, just sort of unintended consequences or things happening economically that, we weren't, ready for. And here's a really good example of that, COVID-19. We had, maybe some of our communities that were more traditional kind of bedroom communities where people live, but then they commute and work someplace else. When we went into COVID-19, that changed the water use pattern. And you may be working in a place that has a water district and live in a place that's served by a different water district. And so when your place of work changes, we know that's going to change use patterns. So that's just as an example of kind of an unforeseen circumstance that would potentially drive the need for a degree of a variance. I do think for the outdoor standard, which is the one that we're working on intently right now, I do think the department understands that we absolutely need to protect tree canopy when we think about water efficient landscapes. There are also places where turf, for example, is important. Schools, other kinds of parks, where people really do use turf to it's a quality of life, and it has a very important public health aspect to it. That turf itself could probably be more efficient, depending where you are in the state. There are incredible adaptations that are being made by the turf industry. I do meet with them and talk to them about some of the innovations that we're making in terms of water use. And so we want to make sure that that is still available for folks. But in other places, I think the department believes that just the strategy moving forward, if it's turf that's not readily used, that's the sort of phrase there. If the only people that walk on the turf is your mail carrier and the person who mows your lawn, hopefully, maybe it's you, but ultimately, then maybe you want to rethink the utility of that landscape. So we're very much focused on doing something that enables water districts to have the most flexibility that also as a way to deal with the fact that different water districts, one, are in different kinds of climates, but also have different different service areas in terms of use patterns. But I would also say, there is $100 million, I think at least in the budget this year to support water conservation programs. And I think I want to say it's 75 million for the bigger urban water districts and 25 million for smaller water districts. We really want, and those are dollars that are separate from, other drought resiliency kinds of projects. And that was on purpose because what we really want to do is generate some ideas around water use efficiency that can be piloted or taken to scale. And that was frankly a way in which I think we thought it was an important incentive for water districts, knowing that there's some sensitivity to water rates, certainly in a drought, but certainly, frankly, over time, given the amount of reinvestment we need to do in our water system. But that was a way for, I think, the state, quite right from a policy perspective, is to draw out some good ideas that maybe wouldn't be as implementable given some of the cost pressures without state funding. So we want to make sure that we're stimulating good ideas, and those ideas can help inform the way a state and local partnership works on water use efficiency into the future. So that's our thinking there. But absolutely, we want to maintain tree canopy for so many reasons here in California.
Director Nemeth, I'm going to ask a question that came in from someone from our local NGO community. And it's an interesting question. And I want to ask this one before we get to groundwater. It relates to groundwater. Mm-hmm. So the question is, will new climate impacts, will the forecasted climate impacts be made available to local water agencies in California so they can start planning out farther than what's typically required in a urban water management plan, but maybe what is also required in a groundwater sustainability plan? So looking out beyond the next 20, 30, perhaps 50 years, forecasting those climate impacts, would that information be made available, or could that information be made available to local agencies to plan for long-term impacts?
I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is something that's been on my mind, honestly, almost continuously since we had our real challenge last year. So for the department, it's called Bulletin 120, and that's what water districts rely on. Some water districts actually are very sophisticated in their own forecasting, and they understand their own watersheds, better than anybody, but some are not. And for groundwater sustainability agencies, some of them are a little bit too removed. So two things. One, it is why you see this governor continuing to invest in improvements to forecasting, also forecast-informed reservoir operations. So kind of two parts. One, improving our ability to adapt our forecasting to change with the times. So good example of that is, some of the airborne snow observations. We've got lots of snow sensors in lower elevations in the Sierra, but we know that over time with the snow line retreating further upslope, we know that approach to forecasting isn't going to give us the accurate information that we need. So these airborne surveys and expanding them throughout the Sierra is going to be really important. That kind of stuff, combined with new ways to manage our reservoirs that account for really important flood protection needs, but also water supply reliability needs. Again, this part of the world is really at the forefront in doing a lot of that work. But for our groundwater management agencies, I think ultimately, groundwater plans are on a sort of a 5-year cycle. They're self-implementing. We have the adequacy question, but they are self-implementing. So people are implementing them now. even if it's a plan that is adequate, it's a plan that will undergo much more intensive review at a 5-year mark. And I think, well, I know our goal as a department is to really do 2 things for Sigma. One is in that 5-year timeframe, put the tools on the table that will enable those plans to incorporate climate more fully into their planning parameters for the groundwater basin, but also really make that part of our regulatory approach to Sigma. So it's not I would just observe that I think that there are plans that looked at it somewhat with limited information. There are some plans that didn't look at it at all. But I think, when we get to that 5-year mark, there are going to be, additional requirements to consider what's happening climate-wise, and that obviously puts a real spotlight on the need for us to develop this forecasting information, develop it in an open way, develop it with important peer review components, so that groundwater agencies and water districts can use that information to plan for the future.
I'd like to ask just one last question, and then we can close it up. What challenges does DWR see over the next 5 years for statewide water supply reliability, especially as Sigma plans begin and get implemented, potentially limiting the amount of groundwater agencies can use when surface water supplies are scarce? What can local agencies do now to plan and prepare ourselves for potential supply shortages? So this is in the context of Sigma.
Yeah, so
and you might have answered it already in terms of FIRO, FloodMar, and those programs, but just digging in a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, going back to FloodMar, I do think we need to, the state needs to do more thinking together with local water districts and groundwater management agencies about what it's going to take to actually implement those kinds of projects. I think the water board, I think, has a couple of pending applications, but their applications, that's for 450,000 acre feet of water, coming in from flood systems. So we are going to have to sort out, ways in which we approach it in an organized and transparent way. In my view, I think there's some real challenges to the sort of first come, first serve approach that has, long been part of the way that we implement the water rights system. And I think that worked for California for a long time. But I think what we're seeing now, because that was really guided by an abundance mindset, and we will have years of abundance, no question. But I think over time, we do need, as water managers, we need to adopt, I think, more of a scarcity mindset. And I think that is going to demand that we, especially in the context of groundwater management, that we establish ways in which to work through the development of technical information that supports water rights applications for FloodMar, but also does it in a way that has an understanding of the system, at large. I think I mentioned this in the budget hearing. The department has done some really interesting work in the Merced watershed, in the Tuolumne watershed, which is very similar to the work that you all are doing in the American River watershed, really looking this, the supershed approach. You're looking at the top all the way down to floodplains. And what we want to do is really expand that as quickly as we can. And we do have budget dollars to do that. But expand that as quickly as we can, over the next 5+ years, so that people have better information. That information is publicly available, it's transparent, and people can understand where that water is meant to come from, and how it does or does not, necessarily affect your neighbor, because that's what we're going to need to be doing in California. I'm going to kind of crowdsource something, maybe as my close here, Jim. One of the things that I think doesn't serve us as water managers in California is, we all like to misquote Mark Twain, and the whole whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. I'm hereby crowdsourcing. We need a new sort of phrase that motivates us, and it's my hope that that phrase embodies some aspect of collaboration, because again, we are we're all enduring a lot of change, and we've got a terrific group of water managers, a great group of leaders coming up, ready to kind of take the helm of some of these agencies. And we're really going to solve our problems better if we're talking to each other, and we have greater reliance on data and information that is provided in a transparent way. If you all come up with something clever that catches fire, that motivates people, let me know, because I'm looking for it. Thank you.
Director Nemeth, we will take that on as a challenge, and we need to do that. We do know that in the American River Basin, collaboration is our asset. It's the way that we're going to solve problems. It looks like we need to embrace that statewide. Water users, NGOs, agriculture, everyone getting together to solve our challenges, and fighting won't lead to the outcomes that we want. I want to thank you very much for participating in the RWA coffee chat this morning. Thank you very much. This is really interesting. I learned a great deal in this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in the RWA coffee chat. This is the end of our presentation. Thanks for coming again. Goodbye.